So, are you now ready to explore some solutions? In this, our third and final round, before we take some questions from the audience, we will discuss potential solutions that we might undertake to make freedom of mobility affordable to the largest number of people possible. We will cover individual CO2 emissions quotas for mobility and consumption, the influence of government policies on the accessibility and affordability of mobility in the long term, and the different means of standard mobility accessible to all. Tammy, let's start with you this time. The concept of emissions quotas are often surfaced as a possible approach to forcing people to change. How might the concept of emissions quotas be applied in a manner that motivates people to be engaged and beneficial behaviors instead of punishing them?
Thank you so much, Cecilia. I think first of all, we need to, track back and understand that, like I said earlier, the realities are different. So what applies to country A doesn't apply to country B. So when we come up with emission quotas, we should realize that, there has been different people who have contributed to it in a different way. And one generation should not suffer for the menace of, another generation. So I think one of the major solutions is to bring it down to the fact that we are all humans. We have needs, and our needs are very different based on how we've grown up, based on our location. So any solution we are providing when it comes to decarbonization and emission quotas should take in the needs and realities of different countries, different regions, different age range, because our needs and behavior patterns are very different. I think that is the first thing. Secondly, based on my experience, attending different conferences that has to do with climate change, I see that most solutions just focus on certain places, focus on the realities of certain places. And it's very important that, when these solutions are being drafted, when these solutions are being talked about, the mostly affected people should be at the table and should be able to contribute so that everything is holistic. I think the second thing is to also bring it to the fact that, everything is in intersection. So mobility is connected to health, right? Mobility is connected to employment. Mobility is connected to social life. So if you say that, we need to bring in clean energy into certain countries, the first question that should be on our mind is this affordable? Does this fit in the realities of the people? Is very, very important to always bring it to context of every place we are trying to provide solutions. So first things first, we need to be human with our solutions and be very realistic with the needs of the people we are providing the solutions for. And the second thing is, when we're providing these solutions, we should bring the people who are mostly affected by the results into the room and also at the table, so that anything we're designing, we're not designing against the people we're designing it for. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Tammy. Ben, how might we think about mobility actions in countries that are still sharply increasing motorization and at the same time have a need to meet emissions targets?
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. I think we need to look at leapfrogging, not to this auto-dependency framework, but one of a multimodal shared electric mobility in cities and low and middle income countries that are seeing motorization happening. While also in motorized countries, we need to reduce that VKT and shift to a shared electric mobility systems. But I will just say a couple of things. One example in India is where the governments and several cities have worked together to overcome the initial upfront costs of electric buses. Recently, there was a tender that was provided for some 5,000 buses to be purchased at scale, which actually brought down the price of electric bus below the price of a competing diesel bus. What the government now is looking at, could they even roll out up to 20,000 or more buses in second tier cities and incentivize the purchase of electric buses. So here you're seeing the simultaneous investment in public transport, but also in electric mobility. I also want to say in other geographies like in the African region, specifically in say Uganda or Kenya, you see a very high use of motorized two-wheelers. And you also see dominant use of minibus systems, the informal public transport systems that are predominant in these cities. So how should we both look at electrifying things like these two-wheeler motorcycles that can and the technology is there, and so how do we begin scaling that up? There's some work that's already being done in that space, and I think focusing on financing of such vehicles is key. And then second, looking at these informal minibus systems. For example, we have worked with the French Development Agency, in fact, on mapping out and digitizing where public transport goes, where it stops, which has not even been known in the past. So how can we use this both to improve services and eventually maybe even link that to how to electrify such services? So it's not just about looking at, say, public formal systems, but in many low and middle income countries, it's these informal systems that we really need to pay attention to. And you know, just one final note, the nationally determined contributions that countries make for the Paris Agreement, WRI, we looked at those and we found that unlike other sectors like housing or sanitation, informal sectors are mentioned. In transport, informal sectors are not mentioned, even though they are the dominant forms of transport in many countries. So let's look at the reality of what and how transport functions in these places.
Great, thank you. It sounds like we need to think about reimagining how we think about public transportation and not sticking with our old paradigms. So thank you. Måns, policy certainly plays a part here. What types of tools are there, or should there be, in a policy toolkit that can incent the shift to EVs and ensure the broadest accessibility to mobility assets possible?
Yeah, you know, it depends a lot on the context and what geography you find yourself in. I think we can learn a lot from experiences in Europe and Norway and Sweden, Netherlands, for example, where we've had price incentives of different kinds, tax breaks, support to public transport, support to charging stations. There's a big toolbox, but if we're looking at specifically inclusion and accessibility in developing countries, I think the key policy measures that is needed is actually support to developing the local value chains for vehicles that will simplify how we can introduce both electric vehicles as passenger cars, but also the multimodal shared kinds of vehicles that Ben was talking about. So I think we need to foster domestic innovation for these vehicles, but also find out the financing schemes, the infrastructure in terms of charging, etc. For example, the minibus fleets that Ben is mentioning, that's a perfect case for electrification, really, with a medium distance and a set, route that you run every hour. It's a perfect case for electrification. So I think we need to. I think we know how to do the policies in high income countries, and we now need to shift our attention to, find out how the benefits of electrification and multimodal electrification can also be shared with in the developing world. And it's both a matter of coming to terms with mobility and also coming to terms with air pollution, which is a tremendous problem in the big, rapidly growing cities. So I think we are now at the stage where we actually can start to use the industry know-how that we have in manufacturing. And we heard about India, for example, where you have domestic industries growing into this space now. I think we can, with a little bit of nudge and a little bit of incentives and a little bit of better regulation, also find those developments emerging, for example, in places like Kenya and Ethiopia.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Davish, what can the government and other stakeholders that actually control resources do to support the livelihood related to mobility within communities?
One word answer, everything. But let me get into the details of it. I would like to split this question into two. One is national level and the state level government, what they can do. And the second part of the discussion is governments of various countries, how they can collaborate. There are two paradigms to this whole thing. So coming to national and state level government, there is an urgent need for action research on the needs of grassroots people in terms of mobility. What does mobility mean to them? Okay, because many times we sit and come up with policies, we come up with solution in a different location, sitting in a different location, whereas the grassroots reality is totally different from it. So it is very important that the last mile connecting organizations or CSOs are involved in these action research so that the good quality data comes out and the failure for various schemes comes down. The failure chances for those schemes come down. And it is very important that whatever comes out in this action research be published globally so that a lot of intellectual people across the world can put their brains into it and make it even better. So this collaborative approach is very important. Second thing, clear guidelines on ensuring responsible mobility. At the same time, how do we balance this rural-urban, dilemma? Because suddenly we want the entire urban area to be e-vehicleized. But whereas in urban side, we are still pushing all the fossil fuel-based vehicle. So there has to be a guideline that we cannot push the dump of urban to rural and just say the rural people, please live with that. Third one is mobility optimization. It is necessary that human and material movement be optimized. And this will have a byproduct benefit of post-production and post-harvest wastage be reduced. Coming to the second part, which is collaboration amongst various governments. For example, in Germany, the solar panel efficiencies shoot up to 32%. But in India, we are still struggling with 13% and 14%. Why is there no technology collaboration for that benefit? That is one example. Second thing, it is important that we do customized pilots based on the geography and the gender to ensure scale up rapidly and in a sustainable manner. Because the game is all about scale up, and the scale up can happen only if there is a good quality pilot.
Great, thank
you. So with
you.
that, I give it to the group.
Thank you for that. Yamina, now from the government perspective, what services should they ensure that citizens have access to as they define their long-term affordable mobility solutions?
Well, there is a framework called Decent Living Standards, which include all the basic services that are needed, and this is what government should be working on. And from mobility perspective, it is first at the land use and urban planning policies that you create either freedom of mobility or car dependency. So this is the first step. And usually this step is forgotten or not taken into account, is not considered. And we jump into directly to the solution, trying to improve it. So if we do not go back, and this is what we in the IPCC report labeled as sufficiency policies, without sufficiency policies, we will not be able to address people's need in the 21st century. And we have enough empirical evidence from our techno-solutionism approach of the 20th century that is failure from environmental, economic, and social perspective. So we need to go back, governments need to go back to what are the needs of the people that they must satisfy first. And then starting from there, looking to the most optimized solution later on, and not starting with technologies. Unfortunately, today our policies are mainly techno-solutionist solutions.
Thank you. That's interesting talking about the technology. In lots of other areas, we talk about people being starstruck by the latest gadgets. It sounds like that from a mobility perspective, we might be suffering from the same types of fascination with the latest and greatest technology. Carlos, what kind of levers do you consider as priorities for thinking about limiting CO2 emissions from transport while ensuring affordability for all?
Well, thank you, Cecilia. One thing that we should perhaps comment here, listening to my teammates, is the fact that if we are relying so much on policies from the governments, then we should start by saying that policies related to climate change should not be competitive. We should not be using policies from any part of the world or any country to rebuild competitiveness in the country that is regulating that kind of policy. Policy on climate change should not be competitive, should not be a weapon to rebuild competitiveness in a global trade approach. That's point number one. Point number two is that we are thinking about all of this in a very focused north-south dialogue. Northern people thinking about solutions for themselves and thinking that they can use those same solutions for the rest of the world, which then does not meet the affordability expectations. It has been mentioned by Temi, namely, it's important. It's also important to think that there are countries in the world that are finding their own solutions. And I would like to tell Davesh that there are now quite affordable EVs made in India, for meeting a specific regulation that has been enforced by the Indian government. So it is clear that that exists, and the frugality that is coming out of India with electrified solutions for the Indian market may show the way to other northern countries that cannot afford anymore the mobility they have today. And finally, I would say here that we should recognize that one size doesn't fit all the problems. It is quite clear, and that we have to think regionally, if not from a country perspective, what are the needs of the country and the solutions that we can implement, because many of the things we have been mentioning may, for the next decade, be related to utopia and not to real, concrete, pragmatic problem solving as it should be. So what can we do moving forward? Of course, one of the ways is to make the clean mobility affordable, and that means lighter. The most important lever to make clean mobility affordable is to make the EVs lighter, which means about finding better chemistries for the batteries. It's about using alternative materials. It's also about having a public infrastructure that supports shorter range. If the range is smaller, the weight is smaller. If the weight is smaller, the cost is smaller. At the end of the day, EVs will be more affordable if the infrastructure is dense enough to provide peace of mind in terms of getting rid of range anxiety. That's something that we can do. Obviously, this is what the industry is trying to do right now. Given the time window in which we are expected to do it, it's very difficult, and it's going to be very uneven, not only across the world, but even within Europe. There is a very, very uneven situation. If you go in the deep countryside of Portugal, where I live, you'll see that the situation is very, very different from Paris. Very different solutions, very different mindset, and very different ways of tackling those issues. So I would say, in a nutshell, to progress now, the best way is to have clean energy and reduce the weight of EVs. This is, from my perspective, the best way to solve the affordability problem and make sure that on a life cycle analysis, EVs are a real game changer for the global warming problem.
Thank you for that, Carlos. And that's the last question in this round. And before I go to questions from the audience, I would like to give the debaters another opportunity to chime in. So Ben, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was nice to hear about some of the solutions being discussed. I just will come back again to sort of overall statistics of where we need to be. WRI has its systems change lab. I encourage people to visit it. One of the sectors that was first identified is transport, where we lay out all of the different indicators in terms of the system change needed to meet climate, and particular climate, but other development goals. But one of these is on vehicle travel. And what we see is the need to reduce vehicle travel from its current trend by around 4 to 14% in terms of the vehicle kilometers traveled. So that means that wealthy motorized countries will need to reduce their overall vehicle travel by some margin, not getting rid of it by any means, but just reducing by some margin. And that motorizing countries will need to reduce from the growth that they're seeing in vehicle travel. And I just want to emphasize again the importance of investing in public transport, walking and cycling, and to some earlier folks' points about this is not only just about an investment in these modes, but shaping the city. Mons mentioned, I think, parking policies, how public space is provided in city centers, creating low emission zones, the congestion charging that we see, say, in London or in Singapore or in in some Swedish cities. These are the types of tools that we need as part of a comprehensive approach that reduces the focus on automobility and improves the focus and really focus on a multimodal transport system that provides more equal access to all residents in the city. That's how we can get to this question of actually freedom of mobility.
Thank you for that, Ben. Tammy, would you like to jump in on this?
I think so far everyone has been able to bring all their thoughts together, and I've also gotten like some perspective. I think I would say that when we talk about solutions, when we talk about electrification and moving to EV vehicles, there's also the side of having hybrid solutions. So we don't necessarily have to totally eradicate a particular means of transportation, but is there a way that there can be a balance and people grow in behavior into using these things? When it comes to systemic, we also have behavioral change in systemic change. So when you're dealing with people, there is a long-term plan, and roadmap to dealing with them in switching behaviors, because it's also one thing to bring in, another type of energy into a country, but it's another thing for the people to adopt that type of solution. So while we're creating the solutions, it's very, very important that we consider the people and also see how we can motivate them to change their behaviors and patterns into the usage of some of the solutions that we're creating. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that. So in this round, we've talked about a number of things. We've understood that we must think about the solutions at a local level. And Carlos even challenged us to say most of the solutions we've been talking about are utopian. But Ben also said we have to act now. We're almost at the goal that we have for 2030. So how do we accelerate that? We've heard conversations around needing different modes, but also people have to change their behavior. We talk about planning in urban cities, what we already have cities in place. So the issues here are quite complex, and I think we've covered a vast range of issues. So this concludes our third round. My hope is that to this point, we've provided insights from different perspectives, but also that the discussion has sparked some questions.